The next two sections of the bone tissue and skeletal system chapter are going to concentrate on how bones grow. We'll start with the major processes that are found during fetal skeletal development. There are several processes important in the growth of bones. In this section, we're going to concentrate on two of them that are found in the initial development of the skeleton. Before we go there, though, I want to introduce two words which essentially mean the same thing: ossification and osteogenesis. Ossification is a Latin term and osteogenesis is a Greek term, but they both mean the growth of bones. The first growth process to consider is called intramembranous ossification. And this is when bone grows directly out of the embryonic tissue called mesenchyme. It's largely associated with the growth of the skull and the clavicles, as well as a few other bones. But those in particular, if you think about what the skull and the clavicles represent, especially at birth, they really define the widest parts of the newborn that has to fit through the birth canal. The process begins when an ossification center forms within mesenchyme. A mesenchymal cell, which is the embryonic connective tissue cell, commits to becoming part of bone tissue. It becomes an osteoblast, and that osteoblast will divide into two other cells, which will each divide into two cells, which will each divide into two cells, and the population of cells at that ossification center will increase. Now, osteoblasts are mostly concerned with making bone matrix, and they do that by secreting osteoids, which are proteins and other large molecules which will incorporate calcium salts into the bone matrix, and it'll start to calcify. As that new bone matrix starts to calcify, some of those cells will get trapped within the bone matrix, so to speak. Now, not like they couldn't get out in time, but they become incorporated into the bone matrix, and those mature into osteocytes. The osteocytes will then be able to maintain the bone matrix for the life of the bone. The osteoblasts continue to divide, and they make up an outer layer around the ossification center, which will continue to lay down more osteoids and bone matrix. As the ossification center expands and it grows into a larger bone space, that bone tissue will start to take on the shape of trabeculae, making it spongy bone, and blood vessels will move into that space. Now, there will always be a layer of osteoblasts on the outside of the bone, continuing to lay down bone matrix to continue the growth of the bone. The mesenchyme beyond that layer of osteoblasts will also start to mature into a different tissue, and it becomes the fibrous, dense, irregular connective tissue of the periosteum. Eventually, the bone matrix that's laid down on the outside edge gets organized into compact bone, making up the shell beyond the edge of the spongy bone tissue. What's labeled in but not actually drawn into this picture is the fact that the cavities within the spongy bone end up getting filled with red bone marrow, and that red bone marrow is going to develop out of some of the mesenchyme that's in that area also. The other process of bone growth that's associated with the fetal skeleton is endochondral growth, which is when the mesenchyme becomes cartilage, which then eventually becomes bone. Now, endochondral growth is what we find making up pretty much all of the rest of the bony skeleton. In the fetus, the skeleton is really just a cartilage blank that has yet to develop into the bony skeleton. As I said, the fetal skeleton begins as a cartilage blank, bone-shaped pieces of cartilage that are still soft tissue. That's a hyaline cartilage, and it's going to eventually calcify into the bone. For a long bone, the way this happens is it's segregated between what happens for the diaphysis and then what happens for both epiphyses. The other bones are going to all just develop as one, as if they're just the epiphysis of one of the long bones. The growth starts where cartilage matrix starts to calcify and bone tissue grows into that area. The starting point for ossification of cartilage blank is called the primary ossification center. A nutrient artery will grow into that space as it's changing into bone tissue, and the blood vessels get invested into the bone tissue as it grows. The diaphysis grows up to a point on either end from this primary ossification center. And then there's going to be cartilage on either end, which will be the epiphyses, and they develop separately. At either end in the epiphysis, the cartilage then develops a secondary ossification center, which goes through many of the same changes as primary ossification center, growing bone tissue in from the cartilage blank. Now, the epiphysis and the diaphysis are going to remain separated by a little plate of cartilage, and cartilage will extend around the rest of the epiphysis until the bones fully form. The cartilage between the diaphysis and the epiphysis is going to end up being a growth plate where the bone will grow longer from childhood through adolescence. Consider this question. When you feel that you've reached an answer, hit the next button to go into the next slide, which will reveal the correct answer. Intramembranous ossification is the process by which the skull and clavicles develop primarily, and the frontal bone is one of the bones of the skull. The femur, the rib, and both develop out of endochondral ossification, and the patella, being a sesamoid bone, develops by calcification of other soft tissue.